Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. I am Sayyid Akif Shah, lecturer finance at Institute of Business Studies, Kohat University of Science and Technology. The title of this course is Business Research Methods, and the course code for this subject is MS 312. This is our lecture number 19, and the topic under discussion will be the research process, under the umbrella of which specifically we will be discussing the theoretical framework and a conceptual model. Dear student, this is a complete research process diagram, and we have already discussed the first 4 steps in my couple of previous lectures, in which we have covered the broad problem observation, a broad problem area with the help of observation. We have discussed in detail the preliminary data gathering via interviewing and literature review, and then we have clearly defined the research problem, then discussed the critical literature review and its importance, which sets grounds for a theoretical framework to be developed. And what is theoretical framework? It is actually the logical relationship development amongst the variable identified as dependent, independent, moderating or intervening variable. So after highlighting the important research variables which might have certain nexus amongst them, we can now make a good theoretical framework or a conceptual model. So dear student, the outline of this lecture will comprises of the theoretical framework definition to set the ground for our conceptual model and schematic diagram discussion. We will highlight certain research cases under which we will discuss the dependent and independent variable nexus development, and what is a conceptual model or a theoretical framework, which may also be known as a schematic diagram. Dear student, what is a theoretical framework? Theoretical framework, it is a logically developed, described and elaborated network of association among the variables which deems relevant to the problem situation and identified through. So how can we identify the variables which are important to the research problem or the problem pertaining to the manager or any specific organization? With the help of interviews, observations and literature review, we can highlight the important variables which could be surfaced as dependent, independent, moderating or intervening variable. Therefore, we can conclude that literature review provides solid foundation for the development of good theoretical framework. Now what actually the theoretical framework comprises of, or what are the important elements or factors which should be there for in a particular theoretical framework, which actually assist the theoretical framework to be considered as a good theoretical framework. So what are the basic 5 elements of a theoretical framework? Number first, the variables considered relevant to the study should be clearly identified and labeled in the discussion. While we are discussing the problem under the theoretical framework to develop a logical nexus or relationship amongst the identified variables, so we should clearly identify that this is our dependent variable, let's suppose, and the other one is our independent variable. This must be clearly identified and labeled in the discussion. By labeling we mean that the dependent variable title must be clearly stated, and similarly the independent variable's title must also be clearly stated in the discussion. The second point for a good theoretical framework is that the discussion should state how two or more variables are related to one another, like what type of relationship the dependent and independent variable may have, like the increase in the independent variable will influence the dependent variable in positive way or in the negative way. If there is 1 unit increase in the independent variable, it will lead 1 or 2 or whatever units increase in dependent variable, or it will leads towards the decrease in the dependent variable quantity. So it must be clearly stated in the theoretical framework. The third point is, if the nature and direction of the relationship can be theorized on the basis of previous researches, like the variable we have highlighted in our theoretical framework with the help of previous researches or the study of literature review, then there should be the indication in the direction as whether the relationship would be positive or negative. Like if this one is our independent variable and the second one is our dependent variable, so in the theoretical framework there must be clearly stated that this particular independent variable, if there is an increase in the independent variable, it will lead towards an increase or it will influence positively the dependent variable. Like in our previous lecture we have discussed about the workforce diversity and the organizational effectiveness. So organizational effectiveness was our dependent variable and workforce diversity was our independent variable. So if our workforce diversity has been enhanced or increased, we were proposing that there will be a positive increase in the organizational effectiveness. So if we have highlighted our variables of prime interest with the help of previous studies from literature review, then the discussion in our theoretical framework portion must consist of a clear relationship between a dependent and independent variable. Only then our theoretical framework will be considered as a good theoretical framework. The fourth element is that there should be a clear explanation of why we would expect these relationships, like what is the idea of the researcher and why he or she thinks that there must be the relationship in a particular positive or negative fashion, and what is the logic or theory behind this relationship. It must also be clear in the theoretical framework. Last but not the least, the fifth element, that there must be a schematic diagram or model which will be considered or narrated as conceptual model sometime in the books. That a schematic diagram of the theoretical framework should be given so that the reader of this research can see and easily understand or comprehend the theorized relationship. What is schematic diagram? We will discuss shortly the structure and the mechanism of making conceptual model and a schematic diagram. So dear student, in total we have these 5 basic elements which must be the important element of a good theoretical framework. Let us discuss an example to explain what is a good theoretical framework or conceptual model. With airline deregulations, like the change in the previous rules regulation is known as a deregularization, there were price wars among the various airlines. There could be different airlines which provide services to the clients that cut cost in different ways. According to the reports, one of the airline named as Delta Airline faced charges or allegations of the air safety violations. They have violated the air safety measure when there were several near collisions, strikes amongst the aeroplanes in the mid-air and one accident that resulted in 137 deaths in 1987. The possible cause of this safety violation is the new rules and regulation, which was the deregularization. And the idea behind this deregulation was to have decentralization. Previously, there was a centralized mechanism for air traffic control, but later on, after the deregularization, the company has decentralized the rules and regulations of the company, which ultimately results in the air safety violations. Now, in my recommended book, you can find the relevant case regarding the Delta Airlines, and you can read out thoroughly that how a researcher has developed a good theoretical framework, what we are discussing over here. So in that particular body of the text, the researcher has highlighted the 4 important factors which are impacting or influencing the air safety violation of the Delta Airlines. Air safety violation is the prime interest of the researcher, which he or she would like to know about that what are the reasons of air safety violation. Therefore, it is termed as dependent variable. And the researcher has highlighted 4 independent variables of prime interest, which could possibly influence the increase in the number of air safety violation, which ultimately leads towards the air collision and the deaths or casualties of the passengers. The first factor which the researcher has highlighted is the communication among the cockpit members. Actually, there was a decentralization, a deregularization, which leads towards the decentralizations. It means that they are not communicating to one particular specific boss, which is the case under centralization. Therefore, everybody is reporting to his immediate boss only, or working in his or her premises. And as well as they have been given certain number of authorities in that specific section. So therefore, there could be a coordination and communication gap between the different sections working in the airline industry. The first possible factor could be the communication among the cockpit members. If there is lack of communication among the cockpit members or lack of coordination, the researcher has logically developed the relationship or statement in this way that it will lead towards the greater number of air safety violation. Or another way around, the researcher has developed the relationship that if there is increase in the communication among the cockpit members, like good coordination is amongst the cockpit member or crew of the aeroplane, the air safety violation will reduce. Similarly, the second variable which furnishes as the independent variable to influence the number of air collision is the communication between the ground and the cockpit. If the communication between the ground control tower and the cockpit crew is good enough, that is, there is increase in the coordination between the ground and cockpit member, then ultimately there will be less number of air safety violations. But as we have explained that the decentralization or the deregularization in the airline industry has actually influenced the relationship or the coordination or the communication between the ground and cockpit member, and this factor is actually influencing the lack of coordination and communication among these cockpit members and the ground control and amongst them as well. Therefore, there is an increase in this air safety violation. So the researcher has made another logical relationship that if there is a decentralization in the aeroplane industry, there is an increase in decentralization, like everybody is not reporting to the same ground tower or with each other, so that there should be the minimum number of air safety violations. So the researcher has made a nexus between the decentralization in the fashion that if there is increase in the decentralization, it will lead towards the greater number of air safety violation. And if there is a centralized mechanism, every aeroplane and cockpit crew should be communicating to the ground tower. Therefore, the ground tower may assist them for their air traffic route, which will lead towards the minimum number of air collisions, and ultimately the air safety violation will reduce. The fourth factor which the researcher has highlighted in this case is the training of the cockpit crew. If the member of the cockpit crew have been trained well enough to handle the different situations, hazardous situations, it will lead towards less number of air safety violations. Another way around, we can say that if there are good training programs in the airline industry for the pilots to handle the emergency situation, so when the pilots will be equipped with the training to handle the emergency and emergency situation, it will lead towards the less number of air safety violation, and therefore there will be minimum collision amongst the airplanes. So except the decentralization, the remaining four variables have positive relationship with the dependent variable, like increase in the communication among the cockpit members, or we can say there is less number of communication or cooperation amongst the cockpit member, it will lead toward the air safety violation. Rather, I must say that there is a direct relationship between the decentralization and the air safety violation. Like if there is increase in the decentralization, it will lead towards the more number of air safety violation. However, for the remaining three factors, which is number 1, 2 and this fourth one, there is negative relationship between the independent and dependent variables. When there will be more communication among the cockpit member, there will be less air safety violation. And similarly, when the training program in the company are high, there will be less number of air safety violation. However, there is positive relationship as hypothesized and having the research background or theorized relationship with the help of literature review. And if there is more decentralization, it will lead towards more air safety violation, because this decentralization is actually infecting the communication amongst the cockpit member and as well as ground control and cockpit crew. So this is actually a schematic diagram what we were talking about initially, that the theoretical framework is the one which may develop the relationship between dependent and independent variable, and it must be a logical relationship, and the importance of the relationship amongst the independent variable and dependent variable must clearly be highlighted. The same example can be narrated in another fashion by a different researcher, where he or she can hypothesize and theorize that the rest of the relationship, like first variable, second and third, remain as it is. However, the fourth variable can set the grounds for another variable at time 2 when it start influencing the dependent variable. Another variable furnishes itself as a function of the independent variable, which is actually the definition of intervening variable. So we can, or a researcher can theorize the relationship of this training of the cockpit crew in the fashion that when the pilot and the cockpit crew is less trained, it will lead towards the nervousness amongst the cockpit crew and the pilot when they will be in an emergency situation. and there is a possible chance of air collision with another airplane. So in this particular schematic diagram, if there is high nervousness amongst the cockpit crew and the pilot, so the researcher can theorize the relationship of nervousness as an intervening variable, which will further leads towards the high number of air safety violation, and ultimately it will result in the air collision. Another way around, we can also say that this nervousness will lead towards the deficits, or we can say that the cockpit crew may have the deficient nature, and it will lead towards the greater number of air safety violations. This is the third case where another researcher may also develop the relationship amongst the variable in this fashion to treat the training variable of the employees as a moderating variable, and a moderating variable is the one, as previously explained, which actually influence the relationship between the independent variables and the dependent variable. It will either strengthen the relationship between two, or it will weaken the relationship between the independent variable and the dependent variable. So we can see that here the researcher has made a conceptual model in the fashion that all three independent variables will lead towards the air safety violation if there is less number of training facilities or opportunities available in the company. Here the training factors, the training to the cockpit crew, pilot and other members, if there is less number of training opportunities available for the cockpit crew and the other employees working in the aeroplane industry, only then there will be the greater number of air safety violations. So such kind of theoretical framework or conceptual model building is dependent upon what the researchers has studied in the literature review and how he thinks about the idea of making a logical relationship amongst the variable. So therefore we can say that a researcher can substantially change the model and a schematic diagram if he can make a logical nexus amongst the variable. So here we conclude a good theoretical framework which is based on the literature review, provides foundation for the development of theoretical framework, and a good theoretical framework has highlighted and represented the relationship amongst the variables as we have explained in our previous example. It explains the theory underlying these relationships. Like in the literature review, you might have studied different theories and identified the important independent variables which can lead towards the air safety violations. Third, it described the nature and direction of the relationship, like three of the independent variable had negative relationship with the dependent variable, while only decentralization in our case was having positive relationship with the air safety violation. So researcher can conclude that the deregularization in the airline industry may lead towards the air safety violation later on by completing the research work. And it also, good theoretical framework has also highlighted that why the relationship is important amongst the variable. So this was all about theoretical framework, making a good conceptual model and a schematic diagram which assists the reader of this research to understand the nexus or relationship amongst the independent variables and the prime interest with a prime interest variable which is known as dependent variable, along with the moderating and intervening variable if those are present in that particular study. So thank you very much for listening to this lecture. If you have still any confusion or ambiguity, then you are free to ask question on my registered email. Good luck for the day. Allah Hafiz.